and welcome to our next installment of our series of storytelling events. We've had the men of North Lawndale, the women of North Lawndale, the businesses of North Lawndale, and so on. And tonight we have the music of North Lawndale. We're going to go back. Well, first, let me tell you the history of North Lawndale very quickly. If you don't know, we were incorporated into Chicago in 1869. That means this year we turned 150 years old. And in turning 150, in that celebration, North Lawndale is surrounded by railroad tracks. So no matter which way you come into North Lawndale, you come in under a viaduct. We want to take several of those viaducts and make welcome signs out of them. We're going to build a community gateway. And we're going to seal a 50-year time capsule. And one of the things that's going to go in that time capsule, among other artifacts, are interviews of everyday people like you and me. So in 2069, at our bicentennial, we can talk to them and we can tell them who we were. Another thing that's going to go in that time capsule, and this includes you guys, every time we have a group together, we try to get that group to say, "Happy birthday, North Lawndale." And we're going to ask you to do that tonight at the end of the program. And then that also will go into our time capsule. But I'm sure you all came here tonight to hear music and to be exposed to the history of our music. So with that being said, first I have to acknowledge Jonathan Kelly, Anna Maria, Leon, Howard, and Darlene Sandefur. Because of them, we're here tonight. And we're really looking forward to what this great group of musicians will provide for us. So, Howard Sandefur.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. As Paul said, I'm Howard Sandefur, the Executive Director of Chicago West Community Music Center. And I must introduce with pleasure the Managing Director, Ms. Darlene Sandefur. Please stand up, Darlene. And the remarkable, wonderful students of Chicago West Community Music Center Orchestra. Please give them a hand. And our illustrious conductor and director, Mr. Jamal Crowder. As Paul said, we want to talk with you a little bit about the music and history, the musical history of North Lawndale. Just a couple of highlights. 1779, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable settled by the Chicago River, developing a prosperous trading post, and that little settlement became the great city of Chicago. Another milestone in Chicago, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire, which made 300,000 residents of the city homeless. As a result of that fire, parts of the West Side became densely populated. The fire also began a migration to the Lawndale neighborhood, which had advertised itself as a residential suburb with fireproof apartment buildings. Immigrants, of course, were coming to America at this time. Czech and Bohemian residents moved also to the West Side. 2 elementary schools in Lawndale are named after 2 famous composers from Europe. Ignacy Paderewski, there's an elementary school on Cermak named after him, was born in the Ukraine, and Antonin Dvorak, whose elementary school is named after him on 16th and Central Park, was born in Prague. I'd like to hear a couple of examples of the music of those famous composers. First, we could play a little bit of the klezmer music. Klezmer music is a type of Jewish folk music generally used to accompany dancing and celebratory events such as weddings, receptions, anniversary parties, and birthdays. And if you know, North Lawndale was primarily a Jewish community in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And klezmer music is some music that was heard prominently in this area. And of course, one of the most famous clarinet players of all time was also a Chicago resident, a West Side resident, Mr. Benny Goodman. He studied down at the Hull House off the west side of Chicago, brilliant musician. Anton Dvorak, he wrote music, of course, in the early 20th century. He was thoroughly impressed with American music, particularly the music of African Americans, spirituals. One of his most famous compositions was called the New World Symphony. And we'll get a chance to hear a little bit of one of his compositions in a second. So this was the music that was heard actually on the west side in North Lawndale in the early 20th century. At the turn of the century, also, the rage at the time was ragtime music, which came up from the South. Like, probably the most prominent, most famous ragtime composer was Scott Joplin. But this was the music that preceded jazz. And we're going to talk about the music that Chicago was famous for. Those three disciplines, genres, jazz, blues, and gospel, they were all played and had a prominent development here on the west side of Chicago. But in 1918, right at the end of World War I want to give you an idea of what the music was sounding like here in Chicago, played by big bands at those times. This was an early ragtime song that was written by W.C. Handy and recorded and made famous by the great James Reese Europe. And please give the band a hand as they play the Memphis Blues. There you go. Ragtime, as I said, preceded, was right on the cutting edge as jazz developed. Also, another music that was really, really big in Chicago and big in all of the country was the blues. Of course, the blues migrated from the South. It actually, the musicologists can't say for certain, as with most styles of music, where it actually began, but they're pretty certain it started in the Mississippi Delta, no question about that. It came up north during the Great Migration and landed squarely in Chicago. It landed in other parts of the country as well. But many places, they consider Chicago the home of the blues. On the west side, again, played a major part, and I will do a little commercial. I'm working on a book. I've been telling Paul about this for a while, and it's going to be finished soon, Paul. But it's called West Side Soul, which will be documenting the history of music on the west side of Chicago. And we'll be dealing specifically with 4 genres: jazz, blues, gospel, and R&B, hip-hop, house music. And so keep your eyes open for that. I'll let you, that's coming out. But regarding the blues, the west side had blues everywhere. There's still blues going on today, but the history of it, we could talk, that's a whole we can do another project on the blues alone. But specifically on the west side, even as recently as the 70s, there were live blues concerts on corners. On a corner of, somebody help me, there's a fish market on 5th Avenue and Pulaski. Come on, that's what I'm talking about. You could hear some of the best live blues anywhere. During the migration, of course, Maxwell Street is where the Jewish vendors had their shops. This is really a big part of history. The Jewish vendors had their shops, and they also being new immigrants to America, is the African Americans, as we came up from the South, landing here in Chicago, they actually partnered with the Jewish vendors there because they would play their music out in front of the stores, and this would bring customers in to the vendors. Interesting point, we always talk about, those of you who know about blues, electric blues. That's really where the electric blues started, because the blues which came up with the migrants were a form of rural blues. Acoustic guitars, no electric amplification. When they came to Chicago, they had to be heard, so playing in front of the stores, and it was very raucous and a lot of activity. Anybody ever went to the old Maxwell Street Market here, just back in the 60s and even earlier? Yeah, well, if you know what I'm talking about, it was happening there. It was live. So what the musicians would do, they would get amplifiers and connect their guitars, put pickup on the guitars, so they could play much louder. And the same thing happened in the clubs here in Chicago. They were loud, so they had to amplify their instruments. Muddy Waters did a whole album, a very famous album called Electric Blues. But that happened here in Chicago first, particularly on the west side. Also, there was a very famous record label here on the west side of Chicago, located at 3347 West Roosevelt Road, called Cobra Records. And they even there was developed what they call the West Side style of blues. 3 artists in particular. We had a lot of great artists. An interesting thing about the artists, everybody came through. It wasn't like South Side or West Side. But the artists up and down Lake Street, Roosevelt Road, that was the place to be. But the 3 artists who developed this particular style, a great young man who died too early named Magic Sam, Sam Maggett, Magic Sam, Buddy Guy, and Otis Rush. 3 of the greatest musicians of all time. Right over at 3357 West Roosevelt, between Holman and Christiana. That's where they had the record label. They made some of the best records, most influential blues records. So that's, again, we're talking North Lawndale specifically in terms of that development. Not only, we say jazz, blues, and gospel, all the great artists, Muddy Waters, B.B. King, another West Sider, Howlin' Wolf. The history is just extremely rich here. It's wonderful. Another great genre of music, gospel music, one of the most moving, emotional music in the world. West Side, North Lawndale specifically played a big role in the development, continues to play a role in the development of that music. The great James Cleveland, off the west side of Chicago, attended Marshall High School. The Thompson Community Singers, known as the Tommies, off the west side of Chicago. Mr. Dixon, what was Dixon's first name? Jesse Dixon, oh my goodness, another West Sider. Could you play an example? This is an example of James Cleveland. It's unbelievable. We got some really, really major artists in that timeline. We could go back to, of course, Thomas Dorsey. From Thomas Dorsey to Mahalia Jackson. From Mahalia Jackson, squarely to James Cleveland. And the other artists were influenced by those ones we just talked about. They're major, major artists. Let's talk a little bit about R&B, pop music, also major part on the west side of Chicago. Things have been developed here. Of course, in the 60s, Motown was the record label in terms of just really popular music. There was Stax Records in Memphis, and of course Chicago had Chess Records. But many of the artists from Chess Records were not just, they were also from the west side of Chicago. Many of the artists we talked about who influenced popular music were from the west side. We were just discussing one of the most famous musicians was a guitar player named Phil Upchurch. Phil Upchurch lived on 16th and Central Park. And just to give you an idea, he crossed over, he played in the 60s with Howlin' Wolf, many of the great blues players, but he also transitioned into the 60s. When the Jackson 5 first got started, he helped them get started in terms of music. Interestingly enough, he moved to, I believe, Los Angeles in the 70s. Quincy Jones heard him and said, "You got to come out here." And he couldn't turn down that invitation. I had the pleasure to interview him, talk with him some time ago, and he said he hasn't been back since because the weather, he couldn't handle this cold weather. He still loves Chicago, but he loves the weather of California much better than right here. But a very influential, important musician. We have up-and-coming singers now in the pop music. And I'd like for you to meet one. Would you please give a big welcome to Miss Lenise Dennis. I always want to call her Dennis. So Lenise, where are you? Give her a hand, please. She's going to do a song, a popular song, a pop song, R&B, that was recorded by, the singer was actually out of Gary, Indiana, but we're going to adopt her for the West Side for right now. And on piano is Mr. Quentin Smith. Quentin on piano.
Making love with you is all I wanna do. Loving you is more than just a dream come true. And everything that I do is out of loving you. La 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 la. Can make me feel the colors that you bring. Stay with me while we grow old, and we will live each day in the springtime. 'Cause loving you has made my life so beautiful, and every day of my life is filled with love in you. Loving you, I see your soul come shining through. And every time that I'm more in love with you. La 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 la, la can make me feel the colors that you bring. Stay with me while we grow old, and we will live each day in the springtime. 'Cause loving you has made my life so beautiful, and every day of my life is see your soul come shining through. And every time that we are more in love with you. La 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 do 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 do.
Would you please give Lanice another hand, please? Listen, Lanice. Thank you, Lanice. Thank you. Okay. House music, R&B, rhythm and blues, again, continues to be developed on the West Side. Rap, there's a number of rappers off the West Side. Lupe Fiasco. In fact, Jamal was telling me, I guess Lupe is performing tonight. He's going to go see him after. Yeah, Lupe is doing international, done really well. Another rapper, Twister. The Brat, also from the West Side. And with contemporary music, you see the lines can be a little blurred, which is okay. Jazz, blues, gospel, hip hop, rap. Just one quick aside, we're discussing with the students, house music is also from the West Side. Some of you may remember, but during the 70s, when disco was really raging, there was actually some, thank you for the 70s, somebody from the 70s remembers that, thank you, Paul, which was a style of dance music. It's very hard driving bass, lots of 4/4 beats, things like that. Down on, I want to say Clinton, I can't remember the exact address, but Clinton around Adams, there was a warehouse. And that's where they used to have parties. During the day, I guess they did what they did at nighttime. These DJs, a couple of guys from the South Side, but in fact, Steve, Silk Hurley, and a couple of other names, but these definitely from Chicago, South Side DJs. They came over on the West Side, and they would have these wild meaning they just played music, people danced all night long. And they called it, everybody was going to the warehouse, but instead of calling it the warehouse, they just called it house. And it's interesting, that music is really big all over the world, even more now. A lot of people call it EDM, electronic dance music. It's house music. And again, from the West Side. Jazz, the history of jazz, and this is going to be our last number because we could go on and on talking about the West Side and the music. But some of the jazz greats have come from the West Side, and it was not uncommon for the jazz greats to also come to the West Side. In the book, I'm talking about a lot of these activities. My father, my parents were on the West Side. They started a little further east. We lived at Campbell and Lake Street, and we moved into North Lawndale in 1951. My father, many of the social activities, they would go to the dances. They told me about dances they would go over on Madison Street. And it was not uncommon to have Nat King Cole there performing. This was before he was Nat King Cole the singer, but Nat King Cole the piano player. A lot of Duke Ellington's musicians were all over the West Side. It was not a big deal. They were in the hood, but they appreciated the West Side, and there were clubs where they could get a chance to perform and enjoy interacting with everybody in the community. The last number we're going to do right now is, again, one of those songs which kind of blurs the lines between jazz, a little hip hop. It's a piece, the lyrics were written by another Chicagoan, the great Oscar Brown Jr. The song is called Afro Blue. And this features our musicians and, again, Miss Lanice Dennis. Please give them a hand. All the songs that we performed this evening were arranged by one of the bright up-and-coming young arrangers, Mr. Jamal Crowder. Jamal? Jamal. Thank you. So we want to say thank you for allowing us to share some time with you, some information. And before we call it a night, are there any questions or something, any comments, anything you'd like to ask or know about the group or about the school or anything at all? We're all good?
Good job.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Now, could you talk a little bit more about the school?
Yes, Chicago West Community Music Center. We're located at the Garfield Park Fieldhouse. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. I know. Thank you very much. The NLC will be celebrating their 150th gala next February. We'll talk more about that, and we hope maybe to be able to join you in some form or fashion with that as well. The school, the purpose, the mission of the school is to uplift the community with music education and opportunities, and that's why we're so excited and honored to be able to have some of the most wonderful young people, not only from North Lawndale, but from throughout the city. Would you please give them all a hand, please? They're just remarkable, remarkable. We provide classes, music instruction in the strings. We have a string program on Saturday called WISH, which stands for Westside Instructional String and Harp Program, where we teach violin, viola, cello, harp, and piano. During the week, we have the opportunity to work with some of the most exciting young people. 2 after-school matters programs. One is called the Business of Music, where we teach about the music industry. The other is called the Berkeley Initiative, where we have a partnership with Berkeley College Music Conservatory, where we use their curriculum to teach music theory and production. We've been very, very fortunate. Again, that the students have been able to travel. They've been to South America. They've been to China twice, and some of the students just returned from Paris about a week or 2 ago. Those who went to Paris, would you raise your hand? Raise your hands, collective hands. Yes, great. I'm saying they were marvelous. They had the chance to work with other students in Paris and plays at a very well-known jazz club there. So we're in the community for the long run. Very honored to be here. And again, thank you all for having us this evening. Thank you.
I have a question.
And a question, yes, ma'am.
What is the age group and if there is a cost?
Exactly. Ms. Sandefur will be able to answer any specific questions. She does all the administrative. So I will defer that to her if you don't mind, okay? And she can definitely tell you. But in terms of age, at Saturday we have some students actually as young as 3-year-olds. Let me just say this, because many times parents want their kids really to start young, but some kids just get it. I mean, kids are moving very young to music, they are reacting to music, and a lot of it has to do with eye and hand coordination, being able to spend time practicing and learning. But we have, and the program, the WISH program actually started for 4th through 8th graders, but now it's grown from everybody, from the young. We have adults as well. And we welcome all those who want to come in and take lessons. Again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks, Paul.
All right, cool. Let's give them a hand again. Okay, so in the beginning, I told you we're gonna wish North Lawndale a happy birthday, and that's gonna go into our time capsule. I'm not sure exactly how we want to set this up, but you guys need to be in there also. So if we can get the audience to come and surround the orchestra, how about that? Happy birthday!